But we're delighted to welcome former Labour Secretary Robert Reich, who, as you know, was Labour Secretary under President Clinton, also worked for Presidents Ford and Carter, and was an advisor to President Obama. He is currently a professor at Berkeley, and he is starring in two films that you might see. One of them is on Amazon, which is, I guess, the Inequality. What's the first one?
Oh, Inequality for All.
Inequality for All. And then Saving Capitalism is on Netflix. And that reaches a large audience. He's also just written a book, The Common Good, which we have afterwards if you want to purchase, and he will sign it. So the Secretary will talk a little bit. I might ask a few provocative questions, if I may be so lucky, and then we'll open up to the floor. But Secretary Reich, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Terry, and thank you all for coming today. As you can see, Donald Trump has worn me down. It's a stressful time for many of us, even those of us who are Republicans. Some of you may be Republicans, but it's an appropriate day, I think, to talk and discuss what's going on, particularly at the World Affairs Council here in Los Angeles, particularly today. Not only is Donald Trump here in town raising money, but also he fired Rex Tillerson this morning. I'm sorry to deliver you the news. Well, Rex did not know either. I mean, you're not alone. In fact, the Undersecretary for Public Affairs, who said that Rex Tillerson did not know, heard it from a tweet. He was fired shortly after he indicated today that Tillerson did not know. It sort of reminds you, doesn't it, of a banana republic? And that is and should be of concern to all of us, regardless of what side of the political divide we are on, because there's really not a political divide. We're all Americans. We all care about this country and the world. The highest ranks of the State Department have never been this decimated in my lifetime in terms of career people leaving and not being replaced, and appointees not being appointed to appointed positions, and the State Department not even being consulted about issues such as the president meeting with Kim Jong-un. I mean, think of that meeting. You've got two people, and I don't mean in any way to say anything in any way demeaning about either of these men, but if you had to think about the fate of the world and put your hands into the hands of two people who are meeting, who have decided to meet without at least any apparent consultation, at least on this side, could you be any less confident in the quality of the personalities, character, temperament, and judgment of two people? And I could go on. But let me just say I'm optimistic. Why am I optimistic, you might ask? Well, you'll have to read my book. I'm not going to give it away, at least the spoiler. But let me just say I'm optimistic in part because I'm a historian, and if you look back in American history, you see an incredible resilience in this country, a non-ideological resilience. I mean, for example, after the Gilded Age, as we called it, 1880s, 1890s, that resembles in many respects our current age in terms of inequality of income and wealth and corruption, Today we call it just campaign finance. And also monopolization. Today we don't even talk about monopolies, but we are being monopolized at a very, very rapid rate. But what happened to the Gilded Age? Well, we snapped back as a country. Beginning in 1901, the most unlikely president, a person who was vice president, put into vice presidency because they thought that would shut him up. And then William McKinley was assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt became president. And Teddy Roosevelt became a conduit, really, for progressive ideas that were already bubbling to the surface because so many Americans were so outraged that their democracy and economy was being hijacked. And for at least the next 15 years, and some historians would say with the hiatus of the 1920s continuing really in many respects through 1945 with Teddy Roosevelt's fifth cousin, FDR, we had a period of reform in this country that led to one of the longest interregnums of, shall we say, the most equality. Now, equality is not itself a goal. Nobody thinks that if we were completely equal, that would be a good thing. We would now have incentives to work hard and invent. But we at least had an understanding in this country that we had to take seriously equal opportunity, not equality of outcome, equal opportunity. And I'm just eyeballing this audience. Some of you may remember, just on the basis of my looking at you and guessing that you may remember, as I do, the first 3 decades after the Second World War, in which, although we did not, by any stretch of the imagination, achieve the ideals that this country feels and understood were the ideals on which this country was based, we at least made an effort. We invested heavily in education and in infrastructure and in basic research and development. We passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid. In 1970, under Richard Nixon, the Environmental Protection Act. We paid for it with a tax on wealthy people. Under Dwight Eisenhower, the highest marginal tax rate in the federal system was 91%. And after you got rid of the deductions and tax credits, it was still over 50%. In other words, we didn't achieve our ideals, but we strove for them. And we've come a long way. I think Donald Trump is not the cause of the problems we are enduring. I think he is the culmination of 3.5 decades of turning our backs on those ideals and letting many things fester. And I am complicit to the extent that I was part of the federal government. I was a cabinet member in the Clinton administration, and I'm happy to talk with you about those years. I knew Hillary Clinton very well. I went, if you can keep this in this room, I went on a date with her in college. That's all I'm going to say about that. No, actually, I'll say one more thing. In 2008, I had forgotten about this date. In 2008, a reporter for the New York Times called me, and she was running for president against Barack Obama. And this reporter said, we have come across, the New York Times, a collection of her letters from her days as an undergraduate at Wellesley. And she mentions that she went out on a date with you. And is there anything that you can tell me, said the reporter, about that date that might shed light on how she will perform as a president? Well, I put my tongue firmly in my cheek, and I said, I couldn't think of anything more reasonable to say. I said, well, I remember that we went out to a movie, and I did remember, we went out to see Antonioni's Blow Up. Do you remember that? And I said to the reporter she wanted an inordinate amount of butter on her popcorn. And there was a long silence. I thought he had hung up on me. I said, "Are you still there?" He said, "Yes, I'm just writing this all down." Such is the state of our political media writing, present company excluded. And I knew Bill Clinton because we had gone to graduate school. We had gone to Oxford together. And in fact, I was there in 1968 when Bill Clinton did not inhale. I did not inhale with him, actually, at Oxford. And then we went to Yale Law School together, Bill and Hillary. And there was a third person. We were all in the same class together, Bill and Hillary and I and Clarence Thomas. Are you laughing at that thought, that specter? Well, actually, I remember it was like most law schools, it's Socratic method. So the professor would ask a question, and Hillary would have her hand in the air first. I mean, she was always first, and when she was called on, she had the perfect answer. I sort of put my hand, I was about third or fourth with my hand in the air, and I got it right about half the time. Clarence never spoke. Bill never came to class. So there are patterns that are developed early. So why am I optimistic about the future? I'm optimistic about the future because, as a historian, we have been here before. We have bounced back. We have shown a great deal of resilience. We are not ideological as a culture, as a society. But secondly, because I look on the young people today, those young people from Parkland, Florida, for example, their courage and their wisdom and their eloquence and their ability to shame adults into acting like adults. And I look at my students, and I don't mean just at the University of California, Berkeley, which I still consider to be the best public university in the world. I mean, there are some other contenders nearby here. But I get around and I talk to university students all over the country, and I can honestly tell you I have not encountered a generation of students as committed to improving this country as the current generation. And that makes me optimistic. And finally, I'm optimistic because, and here's the silver lining on what is going on, I have never seen, at least since the anti-Vietnam movement of the late 60s, I have not seen Americans rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in politics, people who have not been involved in politics ever in their lives, of every age, and many of you, I'm sure among them, getting involved, actually going to precincts, walking door to door, talking to people who may not be involved and getting them involved, and committing themselves to getting out the vote for the midterms and for 2020, and organizing and mobilizing and energizing people. You know, it's only when you are losing something that is valuable that you recognize how valuable it is. This is an aspect of human nature. And I think that many of us are coming to understand how fragile and valuable our democracy is. And that fragility and that value is inspiring a lot of us to take action. So there are 4 reasons for optimism, even in what many of us, including many Republicans, considered to be a very dark period in our history. So thank you again for coming today, and hope you enjoy my book. And now we'll turn it over to Terry.
Well, thank you so much for that. I have a few questions, just a couple, and then we'll open it up to the audience in general. I learned a lot of interesting things from your book. One of the most interesting statistics you quoted was back in, I guess in the 1970s, only 3% of retiring members of Congress became lobbyists. In 2016, 50% of retiring senators became lobbyists. Talk a little bit about what's happened there with our political world, because I think as we look for leadership and this renewal in our political world, there aren't a lot of candidates on the Hill right now.
If the question is why is it that in the late 60s, early 70s, so few retiring members of Congress became lobbyists, and why do so many now, from 3% to about 50%? The answer is, in one word, money. Behind that one word is a factor that I noted. My first job in Washington was as an intern in the summer of '67, 51 years ago, with Robert F. Kennedy in his Washington office. And Washington in the late 60s, some of you may remember, was a pretty seedy town. It was not a fancy town. There were you couldn't go to a restaurant with heavy napkins and silverware. I mean, there weren't cafes and bistros and fancy hotels. Washington was a sleepy, southern, seedy town. And I watched over the last 50 years as it became richer and richer and richer and richer. Why did that happen? It happened largely because big corporations and Wall Street came to town with trade associations and lobbying offices. And I'm not criticizing. Maybe that was necessary. They certainly thought it was necessary. But the net effect of all of that, and lawyers. I mean, if you stand on a corner on K Street, I did this once. Stand on a corner of on K Street and 20th, or any place on K Street, 1 out of 4 people that passes you is a lawyer. 1 out of 5 living things, including dogs and other pets. I have nothing against lawyers, but again, Washington has become an emerald city, and there's so much money there that a lot of that money is for lobbyists, and so you've got, obviously, a lot of retiring members of Congress become lobbyists. Donald Trump said he drained the swamp. The swamp is much, much larger today than it was a year and a half ago. Is that an uplifting response to your question? Is that what you were asking, Terry?
That was where I was going. I wasn't expecting an uplifting response.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the most important things to do is to get big money out of Washington and out of our democracy.
I wonder if I might ask you an international question. A lot of your work has looked at inequality and the polarization of wealth and the 0.1% that own more than the 90% in the rest of the country. And how that has come to, as you say, make us worried about the future for our democracy. I think of 2 other big countries in the world, Russia and China, both of whom have similar inequalities, probably even more extreme, certainly in Russia's case. These are not democracies as we would understand it, but they both face extraordinary pressures. In China, we've seen the response. Xi Jinping has declared himself emperor for life and has been prosecuting a most extraordinary anti-corruption campaign because he understands how fragile the Chinese system is. As people become more wealthy and better informed, they don't like the fact that party members can rip them off. In Russia, they take a more direct approach, where they just poison you with nerve agents if you dare to challenge the wisdom of the supreme leader. We have the great advantage of being an open system, and you mentioned earlier our resilience. Putin is making a lot of headway in trying to undermine our system, at least he thinks he is, with the various cyber hacking initiatives. In Asia, the Chinese have been saying, look, the Americans aren't here, the Chinese model works. Win this round of superpower beauty contests.
Well, I'm not confident of anything, but let me just say that winning, I think, is more about retaining and protecting and strengthening our democracy, in my book, than simply winning an international hegemonic power struggle. I think it's very likely that the 21st century will become, to the extent that any nation, single nation, dominates, it may be China, but I think that ultimately our power, and I'm with Joe Nye on this, I think our power is soft power. It is the power of example. It's the power of the most powerful democracy in the world, setting an example for the rest of the world. And my concern about the present administration, quite honestly, is that we are no longer doing that, or that we look as if we don't care about democratic institutions to the extent that we did before, that we are tolerating tyranny around the world.
Right, so that's my question really, is this just an aberration, or are the forces that you've described over the last 30 years inevitably leading us, whether or not we have President Trump or anyone else in the White House, to a sort of a democratic stasis where we can't renew ourselves?
Well, I'll tell you what I've observed. When I was Secretary of Labor, when you're a cabinet secretary, if you're a Treasury secretary, or you are a Secretary of State, or you're a Secretary of Commerce, when you travel, you tend to travel to the capitals of the world, to Beijing and Paris and London and Moscow and every place else. When you're Secretary of Labor, when you travel, you go to Toledo and Detroit and Cincinnati, and you don't go to the glamorous places in the world. But when I was Secretary of Labor and I went to Detroit and to other Midwestern places, and also Kentucky and Tennessee and elsewhere, what I found people saying, now, remember, this was the best and longest stretch of economic growth we had in the United States. During the Clinton administration, 22 million net new jobs were created, a record. I was Labor Secretary through much of that, and I take full credit for that. But what I heard in the places I went to was increasing distress, anxiety and anger, because the median wage was going nowhere. It hadn't gone anywhere since 1979. And people were beginning to say to me things like, the game is rigged against me. Now that was in 1995, 1996, 1997. Now move to 2015. In 2015, in preparation for a project I was working on, I was out in the same working class places in America, and instead of people being a little bit angry and a little bit anxious, they were deeply angry and deeply anxious. And instead of positing that the game was rigged against them, they were certain that the game was rigged against them. Their wages, the median wage, had not increased in 35 years. Most Americans had not and have not got a raise, even though the economy is twice as large as it was in 1980. And I began to hear people, this is the start of 2015, I began to hear people in Missouri and in Kansas and in Mississippi and in Kentucky, but also in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio, them saying to me, when I said, well, who are you thinking about for president? This is the start of 2015. Invariably, they would say to me, well, we're thinking about two people. One of them is Donald Trump, the other is Bernie Sanders. And I would say back, but that's impossible. How can you even talk about the two of them in the same breath? They're totally different. And what I'd get back again and again and again was, no, what they have in common is they're going to shake things up. They are going to make the system respond to me for a change. Now, that kind of anxiety and anger is dangerous to a democracy. It opens the way to demagogues. And so, Terry, in response to your question, what got us here? What got us here is the incapacity of our system, or unwillingness of our system, to respond for 35 years to stagnant and declining wages for most people. That was a political decision. We could have responded. Other countries faced the same forces of globalization and technological change, but did not and have not had the same degree of inequality that we have had. That is a political choice. We didn't ever talk about it and frame it as a political choice. It was and has been a series of political choices. We're here because of political choices we made or failed to make for the past 3.5 decades.
So to follow on from that, a former employer of mine, Time Magazine, once declared you one of the 10 most effective cabinet secretaries ever, or the century, or something. It was a compliment.
The 20th century.
Good. If we are not so optimistic about leadership from Congress, and if the onus is on us to improve our political decision-making, what do you think of the advice that the president is getting and the makeup of his cabinet now, which we're sorry to surprise people with this, but it's just changed again today? Because that seems to me pretty critical.
Well, for this president, it's not very critical. This president did not listen to his Secretary of State, has not listened. He made a decision to meet with Kim Jong-un by himself, as far as I can tell. Even his chief foreign policy advisor was caught unaware. This president is really doing it on his own. Everything, as far as I can tell. We have not had this degree of turnover in the White House ever before. The last Secretary of State to have been fired after 13 months in office was no one. That is, we have never had a Secretary of State fired after 13 months or 14 months in office. Alexander Haig lasted 1.5 years. You remember Alexander Haig, I'm now in charge? I'm now in charge, Haig. Well, he was fired because of arrogance and because he was really not quite suited to that office. But I don't think Donald Trump is listening to anyone, and that causes me great concern. I have been in or involved in 4 White Houses and 4 presidencies, one of them Republican. I know how presidents make decisions, or at least used to make decisions. There is a process. There are several processes. There is a National Security Council. There are people who are steeped in foreign policy. There are people who understand the economy. There are people who understand why tariffs are not a good idea and would advise a president against putting tariffs on steel and aluminum, as I think Gary Cohn did, and then Gary Cohn left. There are people who understand a lot of things that advise presidents, and there are some presidents who take that advice, some presidents like Franklin D. Roosevelt, who pit people against people so that they can get a debate going. That's fine, that's great. I don't object to that. There are other presidents like Barack Obama who I saw conduct a cabinet meeting or a meeting of advisors with extraordinary skill, actually getting everybody to say and add to a conversation exactly what they brought to the table, and then achieving not a consensus, but achieving a kind of synthesis of the best thinking. I don't think I ever saw a president as skillful in doing that as Barack Obama. Bill Clinton was pretty good, but Bill Clinton used to talk too much. I think a president in those kinds of situations really has to listen and be a great listener. Gerald Ford, I was in only a couple of meetings with him, and he actually did a very good job. He could chew gum and walk at the same time. Many people didn't think he was very bright. Jimmy Carter actually listened almost too much to his advisors. I think he didn't delegate very well. He delegated, he over-delegated. And then he took on too much responsibility after he delegated, and he was kind of I don't think he was a very good manager. But we've never had a president, at least that I have ever encountered directly, who has taken so little advice and thinks that he is the font of all wisdom before this one.
But to push back just a little bit, isn't it fair to say that that consensus building of all the previous presidents that you enumerated led us to the situation where we are today, where an elite decided this is a smart thing to do, but lost touch with the people who said, I'm going to vote for Trump or Sanders because that was maybe a really smart decision made in the abstract, but it didn't help me very much.
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I was sitting with Bill Clinton on a number of occasions. In fact, because of my size, and because I knew him quite well, I was able to get into his limo, the presidential limousine, into the jump seat that faced him. Nobody else fit in there. And so whenever the president was going anywhere, I would run and find out where he was going, and I'd get in the jump seat, and I'd have a private audience with the president. My sense of Bill Clinton on these issues, that is labor and wages and all the things we're talking about, is he understood. He just chose not to listen. That's a big thing to say, and I don't want ever to be repeated in this company. I don't mean that he chose not to listen. That's overstating it. Let me state it a slightly different way. There were a lot of forces bearing upon Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, remember, he lost big in the midterm election of 1994. Beginning in 1995, he no longer had the Senate or the House. And Bill Clinton, for understandable reasons, was concerned that he would not get a second term. And so he brought a man into the White House named Dick Morris. And he proceeded to move, in terms of policy, toward what he thought was the center of the political spectrum in order to get reelected, and that's completely understandable. But it also meant that a lot of what Bill Clinton knew was going on with American workers, American labor, American wages, he could not or would not or didn't feel he had the authority to, given the makeup of the Senate and the House, act on.
Let's open it up for questions, because I could go on all day, but Ken, go ahead. Alexander has a microphone, if you could wait for him to.
So thank you very, very much. Ken,
Wait for the microphone, please. Yeah.
thank you very, very much for coming. I think I want to talk, I hope you can talk about attention span as one of the most integral things that strengthen a democracy. We see that the president doesn't have it. We see that Congress doesn't have it. I mean, after all the gun debates and stuff, that seems to have faded in Congress. The American public has forgotten things. Flint is gone. If we don't have the attention span, how do you expect to do change? I mean, there was two NPR debates. They had a Republican and Democratic strategists. They were talking about some soundbite that was absolutely ridiculous that was out there, and they both agreed it was false. But they both also agreed that, yeah, we can dispel this rumor with, this fiction with just a paragraph. But they both agreed nobody will listen to a paragraph. They won't listen to a sentence. If you can't reduce it to 2 or 3 words, people don't pay attention. And that seems to me how Trump gets elected. And maybe that's a continuing problem. How do you change and strengthen democracy with the attention span being so short at all levels?
Well, attention span is certainly part of the problem, but I think that behind the short attention span is the media that feeds the daily story. And behind the media feeding a daily story are a few extraordinarily clever people like Donald Trump in terms of marketing, feeding the daily media story. We have not had a president who understands how to manipulate the media and the short attention span as well as Donald Trump. And a media that's very complicit. I don't know how many of you remember Leslie Mulvaney's of CBS News or CBS saying during the campaign, how wonderful Donald Trump is. Well, what Donald Trump is doing is making us all very wealthy. And I understood that, but I thought it also a very cynical thing to say, because I think that the media have a special responsibility to the common good that transcends making money, that has to do with extending attention spans, that has to do with telling the truth and explaining the truth, giving context, separating facts from opinions, and all of that. We know what that means. The other thing that we ought to throw into the same stew is the fact that so many of us now are in our own bubbles. We only talk to people who agree with us. We live among people who agree with us, and we go to a social media whose mechanisms only give us the news and the views we agree with. And so we are unaccustomed to coming across people who disagree with us. I tell my students almost every class, the only way, the best way to learn is talk to somebody who disagrees with you, because that sharpens your views. It sharpens their views. You may be wrong, by the way. I used to teach at Harvard, and about 12 years ago, I came from Cambridge to Berkeley, and I wanted to come across the whole country. I thought naively that by going from Harvard, from Cambridge to University of California, Berkeley, I was changing the bubble I was in. Actually, Berkeley is the same bubble as Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's just the weather is better, but it's the same bubble. And I was crossing the country, and I drove, and many of you have had the pleasure of driving across this country, driving across, flyover America. I drove in my Mini Cooper. This was 12 years ago. And I realized, once I got across the Appalachians, coming from Cambridge, that there were no Mini Coopers in the central part of the United States. Now, maybe there are today, but 12 years ago, there were none. And I got to a gas line in Oklahoma City, and I was just getting gas. And these truckers, two truckers, truck drivers, came up to my Mini Cooper, and they tapped on the window. And I put the window down, and they said, "What is this?" Now, this is about my bubble and their bubble. I said, "This is a Mini Cooper." And they then said, "How does anybody fit in there?" Well, I opened the door. And I got out, and I said, "No problem." And they looked stunned. And I said, "I'm from Massachusetts, and everybody in Massachusetts is under 5 feet tall." And they just nodded and looked troubled and walked off. And it occurred to me that the bubbles are very, very, very insular. And I think we've got to, I assume, but I don't know that I'm justified in the assumption that most of you, and I'm not going to ask you, most of you are Democrats and most of you consider yourself liberals. But the question I want to ask you is how many of you have people in your family who you find it difficult to talk with about politics? Anybody? Well, I urge you to talk with them. How many of you have relatives or friends in so-called red states? I urge you to talk with them and even visit them, maybe for prolonged periods. We've got to start talking with each other, seriously.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Reich. I wanted to ask you about what you said about money. Sorry, over here. And I think we all have read about how the financial sector has grown so much in the last 40 years. You know, in the 60s, the financial sector was like 2% of the GDP, and now it's like 25 or 30%. And it's become a casino. You know, so many people make so much money, not on the production of shoes or jackets or microphones, but on credit default swaps and subprime mortgage games, and it's just grown out of proportion. And we've had Enron, the subprime crash, all of that. Do you think it's possible, or do you think we should go back to things like Glass-Steagall and ways in which we can sort of re-implement some controls on this massive casino that we've created that is responsible for the inequality and so much of our financial woes?
Yes. I mean, it's interesting you even asked the question, because this week the Senate is considering a piece of legislation that 12 Democrats have co-sponsored that would weaken Dodd-Frank. Not just with regard to the small banks. I'm not very worried about the small banks, but even if you read the legislation, it would also weaken Dodd-Frank with regard to the very large banks. And I remember a person named Brooksley Born. Anybody remember Brooksley Born? Does that name ring a bell? She was head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in the late 1990s. And she went to the Clinton administration and said, we have got to regulate derivatives. And I was, by then, I had left, but I knew everybody there, and so I knew what happened. And Bob Rubin, who I like very much personally, was then Treasury Secretary, and Larry Summers, and a few other people in the Clinton administration advised Bill Clinton not to take her advice and thereby tell the Commodity Futures Trading Corporation no, we will not support you in seeking the authority to regulate derivatives. Well, that, on top of getting rid of Glass-Steagall, on top of a lot of deregulation, that, I think, laid the foundation for what happened just 7 years later, actually began to happen sooner than that.
You said that I'm over here, in 35, when you were traveling through the middle of the country, in 35 years wages hadn't gone up, and that other countries, Western, more democracy countries, didn't have that problem. Do you think it was health care? Do you think health care, universal health care, is part of that reason? Because every country I could think of, Canada, Germany, the UK, have health care, and maybe the divide between the very wealthy and the not wealthy, if everybody had health care, maybe it would start to equal out a little bit? I don't know.
I think that's part of it. That is, we spend an extraordinary amount. We're now up to almost over 18% of our GDP, our entire economy, on health care. Nobody spends as much as we do, and nobody has a health care system that is as inefficient, where we have over 20 million people who don't get any health care or have any health insurance whatsoever. And the Affordable Care Act is becoming, well, it's unraveling before our very eyes. I think we do inevitably, we all know, the people in Washington know this. Republicans know this. I talk with a lot of them all the time about this. They know we've got to have eventually a single-payer system. And we will. The question is, how much agony do we have to go through before we get there? So I don't think it's the entire story of inequality, but it is part of the story.
When we were in North Korea with the World Affairs Council almost 3 years ago, Mr. Kim, one of our guides, stood up in the bus because a number of us had asked questions about their nuclear program. And he said, "We are a tiny country. We are surrounded by South Korea, the imperialist American bastards," his words, not mine, "Russia and China. We're a little country. Of course we need nuclear weapons. That's the only way we can protect ourselves from being taken over." So with that background, I'm wondering what Trump and Kim Jong-un are going to talk about and how they might handle things.
Well, I have as much idea as you do. I think that their motives are surprisingly similar in that Kim Jong-un wants to be seen as the equal of a great power. I think that is really a deep down in his soul, and that is what his deepest goal is. And I think Donald Trump wants to be seen as a great world leader. And so you have two, in a sense, for very different reasons, but the net result is you've got two people who might be considered, and I don't want to ever be quoted as saying what I'm about to say, but might be considered to be sociopathic narcissists getting together and deciding the fate of the world.
I'd like to challenge and then question two things you said. The challenge is, I think our generation from the 60s was perhaps more involved, certainly put our bodies on the line more so than any other generation. But then, for some reason that I have never understood, we got co-opted, and the whole country got co-opted. And the baby boomers looked for money just as everybody else did, creating this indifference or sound deafness to income inequality and what was happening to our economy and therefore our political system. So my question is, given that, given what I considered the best people were co-opted, why are you optimistic that we're going to get out of this situation, that we're going to break through the money barrier and get back to what this country was founded on?
Well, let me clarify something that I said that you may have misinterpreted. I did say that the generation that came to maturity in the 60s, my generation, with regard to the Civil Rights Act and anti-Vietnam War activism, we did a lot. We accomplished a great deal. I had not seen this degree of activism that I'm now beginning to see since then. And some of the same people are involved. Many young people are now involved. But they do not have, I had the privilege of talking, Terry and the World Affairs Council arranged just a few hours ago for me to speak with some high school students from some of the local high schools. Amazingly articulate and thoughtful and great questions, but I realized as I was talking to them that they did not have something that presumably you and I have, and that is a sense of efficacy. Because after the Vietnam War ended, a lot of people in my generation felt that we had contributed to ending the war. And in the civil rights movement, once we had the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, a lot of people in the generation almost mine, just a little bit before, felt that they had contributed to getting that piece of legislation through and changing America. I lost a very dear friend who was murdered in Mississippi, registering voters in 1964. We contributed a great deal. These kids don't have that same sense of efficacy. All they know in their young lives is a government that doesn't work very well. But I couldn't agree with you more. But my optimism does come from them and also from a lot of us ancient ones. Not ancient, but becoming older, let's put it more gently.
To your left there.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. What is your prognostication for the future of labor unions? Because historically, they've had a great deal to do with improving the lives of workers. And it's been an article of faith, certainly of one party, to rabidly oppose labor in any way, shape, or form. What do you see as the future of labor unions?
Well, first of all, by context, remember in 1955, 35% of all workers in the entire private sector of the United States were unionized, 35%. That meant that even those who were not unionized were affected by prevailing wage and benefit agreements in the unionized sector. Now today, fewer than 7% of private sector workers are unionized. The growth in unions since 1970, most of the growth has come from the public sector unions, and after the Supreme Court gets through with the Janus decision, that may be the end of public sector unions. I think that the union movement is doing its best work right now with retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, child care, and elder care workers. They need unions, they need a voice, they are paid vastly less than they should be paid, and SEIU, HERE, to some extent surprisingly UAW and other unions are making important headway there.
Let's make this the last question. We have a bit of time.
Given
Please.
your very deep experience in Washington, D.C., would you be willing to speculate on whether either Stormy Daniels or Robert Mueller will be the demise of Trump, or is that just a political junkie's fantasy?
I think it's something of a fantasy. First of all, no president in history has ever been convicted of impeachment. Richard Nixon left of his own volition before he was impeached. Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were impeached, and then the convictions, they were not convicted in the Senate. No president has ever been convicted and impeached. Keep that in mind. I think that if Mueller were to come up with a smoking gun, absolutely incontroversial evidence that Donald Trump personally knew of and colluded with the Russians in trying to rig the election of 2016, there might be so much public uproar that it's possible. It's possible. I don't want to close the door, but it would certainly have to be incontroversial, absolutely conclusive evidence. With regard to an affair with a porn star, remember, this is the man who said, well, we don't have to get into it. I think that there is an erosion, a very interesting erosion of support among evangelicals, which I'm surprised has taken this long, but it is starting, and that's not nothing. That is actually an important constituency. But I don't think, no. There's no easy out, folks. It really takes our efforts as citizens, which is what my book is all about, since you asked.
Nice turn. But thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much to Secretary Reich for entertaining us. His book is outside and he will be signing it.